feel like black men and white men, and we've been cool for a long time. Like, we've been athletes, we've been friends, but it's the women that really want to keep this fight going for whatever reason.
This whole idea of mass enfranchisement and everybody having the right to vote, I'm totally in disagreement with. I don't think that everybody should have the right to vote.
Not only is history undertaught, I believe it's mistaught and purposefully so.
Right. I would argue that the Confederate states were actually staying truer to the Constitution than were Abraham Lincoln and the so-called radical Republicans. Many of them were actually in cahoots with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels.
You understand that that's a very controversial hat to be wearing, right?
Is it? Whenever 2020 happened and the government said you'll have to shut down and you'll have to wear masks and things of this nature, we kept right on going.
Bravo, that's an excellent use of your black privilege there, because you know the white Karens weren't going to yell at you for not wearing a mask.
Yes, you're going to have bad relationship between slave and master and good relationship between slave and master, much the same as you have modern bad relationships between employee and employer.
It must be stated that slaves did not have the right to quit their job the way if I have a bad employer, which I've had. I could just be like, all right, I'm out of here.
That's not the case, though. The average American, they are less intelligent when it comes to the way our government is supposed to function than an immigrant who's becoming a citizen. And it's because of our lack of knowledge about history that we continue to fall into the same traps.
Everyone's a victim!
Welcome back to Gerard versus Evil. Very special guest today, Chad O. Jackson. Chad O, it's a hell of a hat you got going on there.
Thank you, thank you.
You understand that that's a very controversial hat to be wearing, right?
Is it?
I don't know. You explain it to me.
Well, the point of the hat is for exactly what just happened there, to spark conversation.
Mm-hmm. Big Ole Miss fan?
Sorry?
Big Ole Miss fan.
Not exactly, not exactly. So for me, it's about the fact that I'm a huge lover of history. And I don't feel that most Americans know enough about history. And it's because of our lack of knowledge about history that we continue to fall into the same traps over and over again, as it relates to demagoguery, as it relates to sensationalism, so on and so forth. And this happens on both the left and the right, by the way. But for me, it's about Southern heritage, which I am a huge proponent of. Being a Southerner, my dad is from Arkansas. His entire family is from Arkansas. My mom is from Oklahoma. Their entire family is from that side of the world. And, actually having had relatives fight for the Confederate Army while the so-called Civil War was raging, I think there's a lot of misconceptions that are purposeful as it relates to what the Confederate states were trying to do. I would argue that the Confederate states were actually staying truer to the Constitution than were Abraham Lincoln and his contingent. In fact, when you look up Abraham Lincoln and the so-called radical Republicans in Congress during the 19th century, what you'll find is that many of them were actually in cahoots with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. If you read a book called Letters to Americans that was written, it wasn't actually written as a book. It was more so written as letters between Lincoln was pen pals with Karl Marx, but it was written more so between various congressmen and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And they were discussing the war, discussing war strategy even. They were discussing economics and other such things. And so the reason why that's important is because when it comes to the ratification of the Constitution, there was a lot of debate around what kind of country should we be. And you had, of course, the Federalists and the so-called Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists consisted of people like Patrick Henry and others. And, we pay homage to the Federalist Papers. You often hear the Federalist Papers mentioned, especially like if you're in law school. Very rarely are the Anti-Federalist Papers discussed.
See, I've never read the Anti-Federalist Papers, and I consider the Federalist Papers to be the original Twitter, the original subtweeting each other and going back and forth.
Exactly.
And I want to go deeper into this because one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is I'm a big fan of your work. I'm a big fan of your courage to be this far outside of what is considered, expected prose. Let's call it. And I am in fervent agreement with you that not only is history undertaught, I believe it's mistaught and purposefully so.
Right.
And especially in today's times when there's so much profitability in divisiveness, right? And people are beholden to these. You talked about demagoguery before, and you must remember I am a comedian from Jersey, so let's keep the syllables to 3 or less for the audience, right? But no. As my father would say, there's no such thing as big words. There's only small minds, and they all follow me. That's at Gerard versus Evil. Appreciate you guys for coming out to the show in Kansas City last night. But Chad, before we get into this, and we're gonna have a great discussion. Tell the people a little bit about yourself. Tell them about your documentary, Uncle Tom. And then you have Uncle Tom 2 as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I'm in 2 documentaries. One's called Uncle Tom, and the other's Uncle Tom 2. Uncle Tom, the original film, was released in 2020 at the height of the whole George Floyd debacle. And then Uncle Tom 2 was released 2 years later in 2022. And so the first one discusses basically Black conservatism 101. What does it mean to be a so-called Black conservative? Whereas
it means you don't get recognized on Black History Month. Is what it
there
means.
you go. And then part 2 is more so focused on the kind of cultural shift that took place in the so-called Black culture over the course of the 20th century and how that happened, how that came into being. So as of now, I am working on my own independent projects and just kind of doing my own thing. I'm based here in Dallas. I own a plumbing company. I'm a family man, and pretty involved in just being simple, being involved in my church, things of that nature. So nothing too spectacular, just making films and taking care of business.
That is spectacular by today's standards, because it's amazing to me that being a tradesman, being an entrepreneur, being an individual, being a family man that's become punk rock. You're counterculture.
Right.
That's counterculture. You wake up, you have a job, you provide for your family, and somehow you're a radical.
Isn't that something?
I can't help but find that to be purposeful, right? And again, now my brain has been so fried. Once you go down the rabbit hole, and once you start pulling at threads, and you see the government's lied about one thing, then they've lied about 2 things, then you know about Operation Northwoods, then you hear about the Tuskegee experiment,
Right.
then you understand that pretty much all of the leftist ideology that we've been force-fed over the last 15 years has been completely and totally a psyop through USAID.
Oh, yeah.
But it's been incredibly effective in sowing division.
Right.
With women particularly. I've said this, and I've gotten a lot of shit for it, but I feel like Black men and white men, we've been cool for a long time. We've been athletes, we've been friends. We're like, oh yeah, we but like men do. We'll throw a scuffle a little bit, then we have a beer, put our arm around ourselves, but it's the women that really want to keep this fight going for whatever reason,
Yeah, I think women have definitely contributed to a lot of the division that we're seeing.
Well, because they never catch any of the accountability that comes with it, right?
Right.
You ever been at a club or at a bar where a woman starts a fight, throws a drink at a man's face, and then turns to you like, "All right, you're up," and it's like, I was just trying to have a good time.
Look at Will Smith.
Yeah, look at Will Smith, how the mighty have
That's
fallen.
a prime example of that. Of that, he's laughing at the joke
She's
that Chris Rock
that's
made.
right. Yeah, and then she looks at him, how dare you laugh at this? I'm gonna go bang another 3 of our son's best friends, and then poor Chris Rock. Has to take out all those years of vengeance, and it's, and it's a shame.
Yeah.
But I do believe it is a psyop, and I want to get back into your history on this, but specifically when you start thinking about these things critically, the idea of wealth in America, right? Sometime around the 1960s, really 1950s, the sexual revolution, right, tied it into the Civil Rights Act, right? But the sexual revolution, it appears now there's some compelling evidence to suggest that this was a movement by the banks to get kids to move out of their parents' house so that people didn't maintain wealth within the family. Instead of 4 or 5 different members of a family, if you're a father and you have a wife and you got 3 kids, and all of those working families maintaining wealth within the compound, building, using equity. Now all of us are paying rent because you can't have sex in dad's basement, right? So now you got 3 kids moving out of the house at 18 instead of staying at home. That's rent. That's mortgage, right? And the pushing of that seems to have been financed through banks that were looking to push mortgages.
Yeah, and that's part of it. And of course, it's a multifaceted thing. You of course had very well connected people representing various who had a vested interest in a lot of the psyops, a lot of the social justice movements that were raging, not just in the 1960s, but dating as far back as the turn of the 20th century.
Is that right?
Even when you look at so-called first wave feminism, even that was a huge psyop. There's a lot of people who call themselves anti-feminists, and they'll make this kind of weird distinction in saying that, well, first wave feminism was good because it gave us a 19th Amendment, but then you get second wave feminism, and that's whenever everything went off the rails. When no, it was a psyop from the very beginning. And of course, like, not to change the subject on you here, but this whole idea
Podcast, Chad, we do whatever we want, man.
This whole idea of mass enfranchisement and everybody having the right to vote, I'm totally in disagreement with. I don't think that everybody should have the right to vote.
Elaborate, but I cannot wait for that short clip. But yeah, elaborate, yeah.
Well,
because I tend to agree with you.
Yeah.
And also, you mentioned the Federalist Papers before. We were never supposed to be anything remotely close to a plural democracy.
Right, right.
They wanted almost an intellectual oligarchy. And if not an intellectual oligarchy, then they wanted everybody to have skin in the game. And of course, it's been, and I'm sure, and let's, there was absolute racism. There was absolute elitism going on, especially in Alexander Hamilton, which is hilarious that he's become the founding father of the social justice warrior class, when this guy wanted plebs. He wanted to be the new American aristocracy. We should be the dukes and we should be the lords, and there's a reason he got shot.
Yeah.
But the poll testing has been shown to be or presented to modern audiences, especially Gen Z, as directly racially exclusionary.
Right, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
That's very unfortunate.
The idea was that we only want people who are educated in these matters to have a say.
That's the objective. That is the objective.
That's the idea.
And of course, to the extent that you bastardize anything, it gives that thing a kind of negative connotation. And people tend to think, okay, what's the word? There's a word for it. Litmus tests equals racism, versus the fact of
poll testing,
versus the idea of weeding out people who don't have skin in the game, weeding out people who aren't interested in basically maintaining our republic or anything of that nature. And so it's unfortunate that when it comes to the average American, they are less intelligent when it comes to the way our government is supposed to function than an immigrant who's becoming a citizen. Well,
that's the bell curve of humanity, unfortunately. You're always going to have, George Carlin has a very famous bit, and he goes, my problem with democracy is think of the most average intellect think of the most averagely intelligent person and then comprehend that half the population is dumber than them, right? And you think of democracy, and and we think of the classics. Aristotle hated democracy,
right? He sure did.
And he thought women were defective men. He thought that slavery was just. He thought slavery was a good thing because instead of just killing off these people, we give them something to do, and we feed them, and we take care of them. And honestly, he defined slavery as what we would kind of define a modern welfare state. And Jordan Peterson has mentioned multiple times a U.S. Army study where over a 30-year period, the U.S. Army tried to figure out something to do with people that were under a 75 IQ.
Right.
And he said there was nothing. There was no objective. Cleaning the bathrooms, there was nothing the Army could give people with under a 75 IQ that wasn't a net negative on mission effectiveness.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's important to mention when talking about slavery, which a lot of people don't really understand, and it seems that you do, is that slavery, for the greater part of the existence of mankind on this earth, has been part of the way the economy works.
It's for the entirety of human existence.
Yes.
Outside,
even if it still even exists today.
300,000 years of human existence that we're aware of. Slavery was the baseline for 90% of us, if not more, up until about 150 years ago.
Yeah. And that leads me back to...
And that's saying that, forgive me, and that's slavery is still happening today.
Exactly. In Africa.
Thanks to us.
Yeah.
Thanks to destabilizing Libya. Thanks to, Gaddafi didn't want to pay back Clinton.
Right.
Clinton goes, okay, we'll see about that.
And that kind of takes me back to what I was talking about earlier when it comes to the Confederate States. A lot of people don't know this, but the president of the Confederate States, which was Jefferson Davis, if you read his writings, he didn't believe that slavery should exist in perpetuity. He believed that the Southern states should have the right to end slavery incrementally in the same way that the North was able to end slavery. In fact, in the same way that a lot of Western European countries were able to end slavery. And because Jefferson Davis, along with a lot of the Southern gentry, understood that the world was becoming more and more industrialized, and that, we're beginning to mechanize agriculture. They understood this, and so they knew that slavery was not long for this world. And many of them, it wasn't just a matter of a kind of practical moving away from of basically tilling the ground with your hands. It was also a moral kind of component to it as well. And then too, if you look at slavery in the South, the relationship between the slave and the slave master, in some rare instances, yes, it was a very tumultuous, very downright violent interaction or relationship, but in most cases, it wasn't that way at all. That's important and yet controversial, but very important to mention, because to the point that we just made earlier, slavery existed for the better part, the overwhelmingly better part of human existence on the earth. And so naturally, yes, you're going to have bad relationship between slave and master and good relationship between slave and master, much the same as you have modern bad relationships between employee and employer. It's the same dynamic. We've just kind of cleaned it up a little bit. And
yeah, but it must be stated that slaves did not have the right to quit their job the way if I have a bad employer, which I've had, I could just be like, all right, I'm out of here.
That's not the case, though. In some cases, it were. In some cases, you could say, I want to be sold to another slave.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you listen to the slave narratives, you can hear examples of this kind of thing going on. This whole idea of, you had chattel slavery and the breaking up of families. And it's made to appear as if this was a thing that was happening commonly, when in fact, what would often happen is if a slave was about to be sold or was being considered to be sold to another plantation, that slave can protest and say, well, no, I want to stay with my wife or my brother or what have you. And oftentimes the slave master would honor that or try to come up with some kind of agreement to make it to where they can still see each other. And in fact, you often hear this whole thing of, so-and-so bought themselves out of slavery. Well, how did that happen if they weren't making money? So in a lot of these cases, the masters were actually paying the slaves, or they were able to.
Is that right?
Yeah. And in many cases, the slaves could actually go in their off time and work for other plantations to make money, and they would use that money then to buy themselves out of slavery. So this whole idea, and I used to hear this as a kid, when we would talk about slavery in public school, of, certain slaves being able to buy themselves out of slavery. And I would often ask myself, well, how is it that they were able to buy themselves out of slavery if they're slaves, if they're not making any money?
Interesting question.
So again, like the more questions you ask and the more you begin to kind of chase that curiosity, you'll find, the whole narrative falls apart.
Yeah. And I don't, I'll have to take your word for it, because I'm not able to verify that. I don't know what you're saying on the top of my head, but I can verify that there was a mass movement of anti-slavery in the South at the time of the Civil War, but it was for capitalistic purposes. They were like, dude, these slaves are expensive,
right,
man. Like, this is a crazy way to do business. This is insane. We have to house them, we have to feed them, we have to take care of them, we got to raise them. There's 15 years of their life before they're, for all the worst reasons, but they were still looking to move out of slavery because they were like, look, man, you don't gotta put the cotton gin, you don't gotta feed it 3 times a day, you gotta gas it once every 2, right? So that I do know was taking place at the time in the South, where they were looking, especially the more agrarian South, was looking to industrialize, to your point. And they were saying to the North, like, all right, well, like, we have to be able to compete with you. And also, it was at that time thought of as a union of states. And when you say this, people roll their eyes at you, but it's like the fight was, you don't get to tell us what to do. Boston, New York, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
You live in Boston, New York, and Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
You live in Massachusetts. You tell Massachusetts, we'll do things our way. And they're like, no, we're going to do it this way.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the fight came. And that's what General Lee says, look, I'm a Virginian. And people, again, the Spanish-American War, right? The Mexican-American War, forgive me, for whatever reason, is just never taught in American history. Right. America got our reputation by how badly we whooped up on the Mexicans. And we marched down to Mexico City.
Right.
The original 9/11, by the way, was the Alamo.
Right.
And a lot of people don't know what the Alamo was. Remember the Alamo? Look at what they did to Santa Ana, I believe it was. Look at what they did to our boys, Davy Crockett. Well, it was a 2-day ride.
Right.
To the Alamo from where Polk and the American regiments were. It took them 4 days to get there. And it's remarkable to me, and as a man who very clearly knows history and is curious about history, the more I learn about history, the more I realize history is nothing more than war propaganda.
Yeah.
It's war propaganda. Napoleon wasn't short.
Right.
The Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. The Pope was just getting pissed off with Constantinople.
Yeah.
So they decided to name the North, the Germans, they're the new Romans. Because they had the Pope's back.
Right.
Right? And the War of 1812, America won. No, we didn't. We were getting our butts whipped.
Yeah.
They came, Britain, the Monroe, the Louisiana Purchase. Oh, look at this idiot Napoleon. Gave everything west of Mississippi. He needed money for his war. He thought he was going to come and get it next.
Right, exactly.
Like everything that we're taught is quote unquote history. And it's amazing to me that people take everything as canon. Right. Even today, when we learn the news from last week is false by next week.
Yeah.
But people take 300, 400 years of what ends up being war propaganda. And again, I think it was Bill Hicks who had one of the great lines of all time. Isn't it incredible? How lucky are we that the good guy has won every war ever? Isn't that incredible? Aren't we lucky? And you sit here and you say, okay, like, why?
Yeah.
Right? And who? When we accept that this is truth, when we accept that we're being lied to, when we accept that we're being lied to purposefully, right? The why becomes to divide us, right? Why are we tearing down, statues of American heroes past? We're tearing down Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah. The
first president to ever have a black man in the White House. Tear that statue down. And then we put up the statue, the 12-foot angry black lady, and what I call the Shaniqua of Liberty. We put it up in Times Square. And to me, it's so condescending because what has that woman ever done?
Right.
Why does she have a statue?
Yeah.
Like, what has she accomplished?
Do you think it's division just for the sake of division? What do you think is the end goal?
I think personally that I trace, and this has become a very popular theory, but I trace everything back to Occupy Wall Street 2009, where Americans of all colors, all races, all creeds, black, white, you had Black Panthers and KKK members shaking hands with each other and looking at the banks going, those guys screwed us. Those are the guys. We lost our jobs. We lost our pensions.
But even when Occupy Wall Street was a psyop.
By the end, they infiltrated it.
It was a psyop from the very beginning.
I disagree. I think it was organic. I think the Tea Party was organic. And I grew up, my dad was in the markets, and I grew up and we lost everything. And I went to the funerals and went to people committed, funerals of people who committed suicide and lost 75% of their net worth. People don't understand. It wasn't just that the market went down back then. There was a huge thing that these banks were doing, and and they employed a lot of people where in order to get away from payroll taxes, they were paying people in stock. So you were an idiot. It wasn't just like rich people buying stock. If you had an $80,000 a year job, you probably got paid at that time 40 to 50% of your pay was company stock, so that the company would only pay you $40,000. and then you get $40,000 in Bank of America stock. And who doesn't want that? Because the stock only goes up. Bank of America loved it because they only had to pay payroll tax on 40 grand, right? So now guys have been working for 10 years and have accumulated half of that time in stock. And then over a 3-day period, 75% slip.
Right.
Guys killed themselves.
Right.
And then we saw the bank bailouts. Who got bailed out? Not the everyday person, not the pensioner, not the person who was actually working. CEOs got fired, but they got $25 million.
Yeah.
Not a single, I think one person was arrested.
Yeah.
One person. You know, and so, a very long story, forgive me. I think when you look at demographics, why are we vilifying the Confederates as these vile, reprehensible racists? Well, they had the nerve to stand up to the federal government.
Right.
They had the nerve to say, I want to be governed. I want to govern myself. Why are statues of our founding fathers being torn down? They told the British Empire, I got 2 of these for you.
Yeah.
You know, why, for lack of a better term, why are white men under attack for the last 10 years? American white men.
Right.
Well, because if you look at voting demographics, there's really only one voting demographic that is clearly, always, consistently pro-small government, right? If all men voted, right, black men are more small government than black women, but black men are still, you know, they still vote towards more government, right? Why is the Democratic Party turned on Latin men? Because naturalized American Latin men hate the government. They're hardworking. They're laborers. They don't want. They want entrepreneurship. They want freedom. They don't want taxes, right? So I believe as we were taken over essentially by globalists after 2001, and especially after 2008, they said we have to get rid of this American ideology. We have to get rid of this founding mythos of liberty. And we have to get rid of the people that are not just willing to die for freedom.
Right.
Are willing to kill for freedom.
Yeah. And what you're explaining, because it seems, if I'm not mistaken, based on what you're saying, that you were actually part of the Occupy Wall Street movement.
I wasn't part of
or
it.
At least you sympathized.
I was playing minor league baseball at the time.
Right.
I wasn't in politics.
Yeah.
But I sympathize would be yes.
Sympathize with it.
And yeah, you know, and dude, I went into college Democrat.
Yeah.
And then I saw the performative feminism, especially, and you know that I was an athlete, and they would say, "Look to your left and look to your right," and they'd say, "One of these men will, you know, one of these men are likely to rape you." And I'm like sitting here like, "This is nuts.
Right.
This is insanity." Then the women would do the performative stuff, and I'm like, "All right, well, I'm definitely not whatever this is."
Yeah.
And then I was introduced to Ron Paul, and you know, my libertarian, you know, it made all the sense in the world to my young mind, and I was a libertarian for a very long time, and I would love for libertarianism, which seems to be making a comeback, to be kind of our guiding light. But, you know, libertarianism has its flaws because what we've been shown is that the extremes, the far left, the far right, they will never leave you alone.
Yeah. Well, so it seems that the Occupy Wall Street thing hits home to you because of the fact that you say you went to funerals and you know people who have died and things of this nature.
Well, I think it was the first real populist movement of my life that got any sort of traction.
Yeah. And as you know, as someone who obviously is clearly knowledgeable to history, it actually didn't start with Occupy Wall Street. This whole idea to kind of be on the march toward globalism, it actually dates as far back, I would argue, to even before this point, but even the founding of our country. Of the formulation of the so-called United States of America.
Well, obviously you have 1913.
Right.
You know, and you know, it's funny you say that because I've always theorized, you know, us and Americans, we think in terms of years, once every 4 years. Europe has dynasties that are centuries old.
Right.
I feel like Europe, especially the British Crown, has always thought of us as, you know, the wayward child that is always going to come back into the fold. They look across the, you know, I think Europe just thinks of us as like we're a country on Rumspringa. Eventually, we're going to come back under their thumb. They love government over there.
Yeah, they do.
I mean, they've got government on top of government on top of government.
I'm having a hard time here, though, because, like, I hear what you're saying, and you have a very clear, and I would say a well-identified awareness of the fact that the government and a lot of large corporations are problematic when it comes to preserving our republic. Let me know if I have anything wrong so far. However, you seem to be for a kind of populist solution to the problem. Insofar that you would say that Occupy Wall Street from its inception was a good thing, but then it got infiltrated. This is where I would disagree.
Okay.
I think that populism is the problem, because populism gives way to the very demagoguery that creates this kind of repetitive cycle that we see over and over and over again. Man's desire to be governed, man's desire to vote for someone who has a solution to the problem we say we have. And so this kind of collectivist
it creates an incentive to create problems.
It creates an incentive to create problems.
Reverse,
and so you see the
exactly,
cyclical thing. And to kind of bring everything back full circle to the beginning of this conversation, where you commended the kind of simple lifestyle of a man with his wife and with his kids and going to church and just being the salt of the earth, that I think is what it really comes down to. We have to begin to detach ourselves from this monster in as many ways as we physically can. When it comes to, I mean, a lot of it's so convoluted and we're so infrastructurally intertwined with the way our banks work, with the way that the economy works, with the way that, investments and stocks and everything else works. So you can only detach yourself so much. But to the extent that you begin to think outside the box and really become an individual, really get back to that old, kind of Confederate way of sovereignty and autonomy thinking, then we're only going to keep finding ourselves in these situations where we're shaking our fists and railing against the government because we put so much trust in it. And then we're surprised when the rug gets slipped out from under us. And so for me, like during 2020, I'm a small business owner. Whenever 2020 happened and the government said y'all have to shut down and y'all have to wear masks and things of this nature, we kept right on going. Our employees stayed employed. I proceeded as if nothing ever happened. I would go into businesses maskless, and if I was asked to leave, I would leave. But if it was a situation where a small business here in Dallas were trying to be precautious when it comes to the spread of this thing, I understood this because I respect a business owner's right to run their business in the way that they see fit. However, if it was a situation where, we have to abide by what Clay Jenkins said, the Dallas County judge, because I don't want to be fined, I would basically try to give them a little pep talk and inspire them. Hey, like you're an American, like you have rights in this country. Like don't live in fear. And of course I would be amicable with how I said it. I wouldn't be a jerk about it. But I think we need that. We need to remind each other to be individuals, to be, not be so inextricably intertwined with the system and how it works and how it operates. And I know that sounds very impressionable and it sounds very pie in the sky, but there are ways that we can do that.
It's not. But you're right. And first of all, bravo. That's an excellent use of your black privilege there, because the white Karens weren't going to yell at you for not wearing a mask. If it was me, she'd be in my shit like this. But they, I don't know, I don't want to be a racist. Shut up. Yeah. So well done. But that leadership is something men are lacking. And when we talk about Gen Z and we talk about what's happened and the quote unquote pussification of America, well, it's us. We did that because we were taught a certain way, and then we were afraid of the Karen. Mm-hmm. We were afraid of being canceled. And I think about my grandfather in Korea and Vietnam, like, holding his buddy's guts in his hands and looking down on me as I'm like, I don't know if I should tweet this. This is dangerous.
Yeah.
And he's like, you got to be kidding me, man.
Right.
And but I feel like that's coming back around. And unfortunately, the Hegelian dialectic, the rubber band effect, is maybe coming around too far. And we were talking before about Elijah Schaffer and what James Lindsay calls the woke right. And now, there's a certain grift where if you're a black guy, you can become a millionaire for stabbing a white kid in the heart. And if you're a white woman, you can become a millionaire for calling a child the N-word. And those battle lines have been drawn. Right. And I don't want to live in a society where either one of those things are profitable.
Right.
And we're caught in the crosshairs. And then during my time in government, what I think the most disappointing thing, and maybe this goes to your populism point, was 90% of people, 90, easily agree on 90% of things. The Overton window in America truly is this big.
Mm-hmm.
We all want the same outcome. We just disagree on the nuance of how to get there, right? It's the 5% on either side. And you have politics in America being driven by the crazy and the greedy.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the only people that get anything in this world. And those are because 90% of people are never going to donate $1 of their hard-earned income to a politician.
Mm-hmm.
And 90% of people are never going to donate a minute of their free time
Mm-hmm.
to a political cause.
Yeah.
So if you don't donate your time and if you don't donate your money, why on earth would anybody promote your worldview? There's no profit in it, right? And that's where we have these profit centers in government that are driven to the crazy or the greedy.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my pie in the sky ideal is that populism works because of exactly what you're saying. You take somebody who has their shit together and you promote them, not the avarice, not your celebrity who's going to end up being a pedophile in 6 months. You know, one by one and little by little, we're seeing this take off. Men are becoming men again. We want women that are noble women. That like you're seeing this happen organically, because I think it's something intrinsic inside all of us. I think we all genuinely want to be good, but we've done so much. Globalism is top-down governing.
Mm-hmm.
Let's focus on making the world a better place. Well, my room is not even clean, right? So we get to a point where your room is clean, clean your house. Your house is clean, clean your yard. Your yard is clean, clean your street. Your street's clean. All right, take care of your city. City's good. All right, let's take care of the state. State's good. Now let's do the nation. Now your nation's good.
But it gets very ugly, though.
Well, because there's a lot of money involved, right?
Well, there's money involved, but the thing is...
ton of money in division, Chad. Ton of money.
What your equation lacks, because you mentioned the 90%, and then you got the other 10%, 5% made up of these people, 5% made up of those people. What your equation lacks, and I think you know this. I think it's a thing where it's like you kind of laid it out beautifully, but then when you get into the nuances, it's then time to kind of flesh it out. And so here we go. So when you look at the 90%, you have to ask yourself, okay, they might agree on all of these things, be they habitual Democrat voters or habitual Republican voters. They might agree on a bunch of things, irrespective of what party they represent or vote for. However, we have to ask the question, what has given rise to the things that they agree on? And are the things that they agree on even for their best interest? We all go to the same public schools, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you are on. You all are getting the same education to the point you made earlier, that is revisionist history, that is told by the so-called victors, who have a vested interest in shaping your knowledge of the past, that they might then influence the laws of the now in order to move us in a direction toward the future that is, again, more feasible to a certain demographic of globalists, more so than the average Joe. And so what I'm trying to say here...
The brainwashed don't know that they're brainwashed.
Exactly. They don't know that they're brainwashed. And so we all go to the same schools where we are indoctrinated to be statists. And I think that's a word, that word statist, is a word that most people don't know anything about. And they don't know that this is a word that we should avoid like the plague. Or not the word itself, but the reality of being a statist. This notion that all of the problems that we have has a government solution to it. And I made this point before, and I'm not the first person to make this point. When you wake up in the morning, every day, you have decisions to make. Whether you're going to get off out of bed or not get out of bed. Whether you're going to brush your teeth, not brush your teeth. Eat breakfast, not... Like, all day long, you are making all kinds of decisions.
Speaking of, shocking to me, people brush their teeth when they wake up and then eat breakfast. You should eat the breakfast, then brush your teeth.
But again, these are decisions, right?
Yeah.
The decision of who you should vote for comes once every 2 to 4 years, right? And so you have more autonomy than you realize. However, when it comes to any given issue, the first place that most of our minds go is the government should do something about this. And of course, we all share a country, and we all share a state, and we all share a community, and we are all governed by laws within those respective entities. And so naturally, you have to ask the question of, okay, how should we, as a community, make a decision on this or that, or how this or that should be regulated? I understand that. But the point that I'm making is most of the things that really affect you are day-to-day decisions that you make that doesn't have anything at all to do with the government. And so the fact that many of us, again, operate from this kind of statist purview, where we feel as though we are powerless to do anything about our own situation. You then get all of these kind of baked into the cake regulatory solutions that we haven't really given a lot of time in thinking about these so-called solutions. We just believe that they're supposed to be the solution because we've been indoctrinated so long into understanding these as a solution. And the last point that I'll make is you don't have entire fields of study like the cognitive sciences and the social sciences for nothing. These courses exist in the colleges and universities for a reason. These are made up of people who oftentimes, of course, isn't everybody who takes these courses, but oftentimes the people who take these courses have an interest in planning society. They want to plan society in such a way that people live by the dictates of the world.
Control freaks,
yeah. And so it's like, and so these people, they get into policymaking jobs. They run for government. They do all sorts of things because they want to shape and plan society.
Same person, if you came into their house and moved their toothbrush, they would lose their mind.
Exactly.
They're OCD, they're ordered, and they need this. Like the efficiency model that you're describing, and this is where the technocracy gets really dangerous. Life is inefficient.
Right.
We're moving towards this, and I love Doge, and I love what Doge is doing, but I get weary of the hyper-efficient people because in a hyper-efficient world, there's no such thing as dating.
Right.
You're scanned, your blood is tested, and you're matched up with, your ideal mate because the resources that are wasted and the time that are wasted and the inefficiency of dating and the inefficiency of fun. I'm a comedian. Comedy is the most inefficient art form. You work for years to find a joke that works, and then it takes that joke 2 years to get perfected. That's time that should have been done mining coal.
Right.
So I think humans thrive in inefficiency. I think that there's incredible beauty in that chaos. And Alan Watts used to talk about the concept of playing life, not living life, playing life.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you tend a little towards anarchism.
But no, absolutely not. But the thing about the efficiency piece is that's fine for on the street. But is like this kind of fluidity? I think that's kind of what you're talking about. Like you need room for error. You need room for you to be human, quite frankly.
Well, I'll say something that it gets me excommunicated from my libertarian circles, right? Like I'm okay with big government. I think government has a place. The problem is I'm not okay with corruption. I'm not okay with avarice. I'm not okay with fraud. If the progressives were smart, they probably wouldn't be progressive. But if progressives were smart, they would get behind Doge 100%. They would say, yes, absolutely. Let's whittle this thing down to its nub. Let's get rid of all the corruption. Let's get rid of all the fraud. Let's find out exactly what our government is doing well. And then once we're doing that, then we can figure out how to expand from there. And that should be their argument because nobody would be able to counter that argument. Because the idea is not like, you don't want, poor kids to have access to public pools. And it's like, what? No. Like, I just don't think a public pool should cost $18 million. Right? Well, okay. If you actually care, if you're not in on the grift, let's get down, find out what the fraud is, eliminate the fraud, and then you get your public pool, right?
Yeah.
Because we know it's about fraud and corruption. But now we know what the game is, right? The game is that's built in.
Right.
The game is, look, they know public education is cooked.
Right.
They know it. The worst kept secret in America is that public education is nothing more than a jobs program.
Right.
It's a jobs program for most people that just can't compete in the private sector.
Right.
And the shocking thing is these people think they're better than you, the plumber.
Right.
It pisses off these intellectuals to no end that they have a PhD, but a plumber makes 3 times as much money as they do.
Yeah.
The system is broken. No, it's not. because he does a job you don't want to do. People pay for that.
Right.
It's not about what you know, it's about what service you provide. And unfortunately for you, the person that is doing gender studies is not providing service unless it's somehow made compulsory, mandatory.
Right.
And all of a sudden, this thing that nobody ever wanted, nobody ever bought, costs $50,000 an hour to have Robin DiAngelo teach you how not to be racist.
Yeah. I mean, but you know, I think what you're talking about, like, there's an inevitability kind of built into it, because these are governments that are made up of human beings who are going to, regardless of if they win a populist vote on the left or the right or whatever the case may be, you're going to continue falling into the cycle. And that's why, for me, like, I vote for Republicans, but you'll never hear me call myself a Republican.
Sure.
Nor will you ever see me believing and nodding along with a Republican politician's campaign speech, because I know most of the time they're just lying to get a vote.
Yeah. I think we should all be free agents.
Well, the thing is,
win my vote every 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Win my vote.
They should have to work for it.
I'm for sale, baby. Give me the best deal.
They should have to work for it. But the thing is, like, what I'm advocating for in the way of small government is something that most Americans don't want. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier with the 90%. Most of those in the 90% are indoctrinated to believe that a big government will be the solver of all their problems. And it's becoming more and more of a concern for me in this day and age on this side of the technocracy, simply because as you see an advancing of artificial intelligence and robotics, and you see these things kind of begin to take a toll in the workforce, and you see people begin to be displaced, this whole notion of big government, of a nanny state, will become all the more attractive. And this is going to have a very detrimental impact on society, because there's many reasons, but I think the easiest reason to point out quite readily is the fact that work in itself has a character building component to it. And to the extent that, I mean, if you look at any major city,
structure.
If you look at any major city where there's high unemployment, where there's not any kind of of structure, then naturally the character of these youngsters who are coming up will be subpar, to put it lightly. And that's a society that no one wants to live in, trust me. And so the thing is like, what this is going to do is it's going to create even more of an incentive for demagogues to come along and to promise you, the pie in the sky, promise you all the things. And again, it creates this cycle once again. So this is where we are.
Well, even if they're structurally, working remote's killing the cities.
Right.
Because the entire city infrastructure there's a building with a lot of people.
Right.
And then there's a pizzeria next door that feeds the building with a lot of people. And then there's a dry cleaner next door to the pizzeria that cleans the clothes of a lot of people. Now those people don't come in anymore.
Yeah.
Who does the pizzeria feed? Who does the dry cleaner make their money off of? Those businesses now go under. Right. And now you have these, what they call economic deserts.
Right.
Because the REITs and real estate investment trusts are keeping those businesses, those commercial real estate properties at $28 to $32 a square foot. And the market says that should be a $14 a square foot investment.
Right.
But they're selling the portfolio, which, this is, again, to me, this is where government actually does have a place, where you can't allow China and hedge funds to buy up entire city blocks and sit and hold them hostage. That's not a free market. Right. They can't be profiting off of this place being a commercial desert. They're killing the city. And that's where I think, again, regulation has a place where, if you're building and it's yours, but this corporations or people thing is bullshit. No, it's not. Right. It's very different than BlackRock owning every property on 32nd Street than your mom and dad making an investment in one of those properties. And BlackRock then submarining the value of that property because your mom and dad can't sit on it for 14, 15 years till the area gentrifies. Right. They're going to lose on that investment. They should be protected. Right. And that's where my ADD is going crazy right now. that's where, you know, government should step in and say, look, if your building is unoccupied, then there should be higher taxes. And if you're going to leave a place unoccupied for 4 or 5 years, okay, but there's your effective tax rate is now 50, 60%.
Yeah.
You should have to bring the prices down to what the actual market value is and give a small business owner a chance. Somebody wants to open up a cookie shop, a lemonade stand. In America, they should be able to afford to.
Yeah.
Like the business owner should be able to compete on the same block that JP Morgan's on. That's my vision of America. And I think Teddy Roosevelt did a great job when he busted up those big monopolies. And I would love to see, you know, and our monopolies are way worse now. They're global.
Yeah, I think I disagree with that last part about the government breaking up monopolies or what have you. So here's the thing, because I can definitely see where you're coming from when you say that
somebody's got to bully the bully, Chad.
when you say that, like, my views can come off as anarchist. I'm certainly not an anarchist. I do believe.
I don't think anarchy is not a bad thing.
I believe it is. I believe it totally is. One of the ways I do believe in. I agree with a lot in the Federalist Papers, but I think John Jay said something to the effect of wherever there's humans, there's going to be government that the people vest with certain requisite powers. This is just unavoidable because we as human beings, we want to be governed.
Says, I think it says, and then quotes it directly.
Right. and so the thing is like, and I agree with Jay. I agree that so long as there's two people living in a shared space. Yeah. If there's going to be any kind of order of acknowledging this is my space, that's your space. You don't steal my things. I won't steal your things. X, Y, and Z, you're going to have to set up some kind of structure in order to maintain civility on the land. And so for that reason, I definitely believe we should have regulation. What I'm speaking against is this kind of over-regulation, this kind of runaway train, this government run amok that we, the people, keep feeding. I mean, our tax rate, the fact that we even have a federal income tax, on and on I can go. This is just haywire.
Couldn't agree with you more.
The fact that FDR...
And I'd rather have too little government than too much. I want to be very clear. I like with Doge and with cutting government, I want to cut it to when it hurts. And then, okay, let's put that back. Like I want okay. Yeah. Like I want that.
Right.
Like I'm all for go fast and break things. Right. We've especially now that we know like 90% of our tax dollars have been going to nonprofits that have completely gained the system and have just been stealing our money and sending it abroad. I mean, it's insane. We have spent $15 trillion on wars abroad since 2001, and we haven't fixed a single pothole in America. To call back to one of my most viral videos, but it's true. and I want to ask a couple and I'm having a great time with you here. We could talk for 3 hours, man. Personally, it takes courage to have the opinions you have as publicly as you have them, as the type of person you are in America. When I look at your comment section, and easily 9 out of every 10 comments is positive. But when you get hate, the hate seems to be visceral.
Yeah.
People don't seem to like it. And it seems to be predominantly black men and white women and black women that don't like what you're saying. And they have a very visceral reaction to what you're saying. How has your life been since you've, I guess, publicly come out as, you're not, forget Republican, but as an anti-status, as anti-establishment, right?
That, by the way, I think is the best thing that anyone's ever labeled me, politically speaking, because people struggle. But kudos to you. That's the best explanation for. I'm
an anti-status as well, except for. I always go back to Milton Friedman's quote about capitalism, and capitalism is the worst economic system except for every other one that's been tried.
And I wouldn't even call myself a capitalist. But finish your question.
Yeah, so it's a personal question to you, about becoming very public in your perspective, in your persona, and then I'd double down on it and ask, why do you think the black community in particular is so beholden to the statist ideals of progressivism?
That's a very
And I need you to speak for all black people right now.
That's a big question. That's
Yeah.
a huge question that I don't think I can answer quickly, but I'll try my very best. So when you look at Black Americans in America, when you look at blacks in America from the end of slavery, and you look at their white counterparts across the board, they were kind of trending at the same rate. And when I say white, I mean people who have migrated here from European countries. Across the board, they were kind of trending in an upward trajectory across the board, especially as you kind of have this increase in industrialization. Even if you look at old photographs of blacks and whites, they're dressed the same. They kind of have the same swagger. They speak the same even.
Well, if you believe Thomas Sowell's white liberal black redneck, and there's a couple other Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote about this as well. A lot of black culture stems from Scotch-Irish culture,
right?
The indentured servitudes, you know, because they were it makes sense from a modern perspective. You know, they were the quote unquote cool kids in the back of the bus. They were allowed to talk back to the owners. They were basically slaves themselves, but they weren't, right? So they had that one little bit of freedom where they can make fun of the boss, and you know, and then you know our Irish culture.
Oh, you're Irish.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's so. And we'll get back to it, but one of my best friends got very deep into Black Lives Matter when it happened, and our friendship wasn't able to make it. And one of his big problems was essentially he called it a lack of empathy. He said, "I don't have a lack of empathy." I said, "I had a lack of gullibility." And much to how you started this, I understand my history and my family's history.
Yeah.
And I just for the life of me, I could feel bad about what was happening, but when I saw George Floyd, the world saw a white cop and a black man. I saw an agent of the state and a citizen. I said, "There's no look, it's black and white, and of course, right?" But my whole thing was that and this was when people were talking about him on fentanyl and everything like that. The state, the government doesn't have the right to kill the people who fund the government. The government doesn't have the right to kill one of its citizens, regardless of what he's on or not. Right? Like that to me was a very clear government overreach issue.
Yeah.
Right? This is a cop. At
the time, or is that still your view?
No, at the time. At the time, because all the police brutality issues that were coming up. And it was very interesting. With all the Black Lives Matter and all the wealth inequality stuff and everything happening, they never once mentioned credit score. That's how you know who's behind it, right?
Right.
The real driver of wealth inequality in America and the world is credit score. It is literally the way that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, right? But credit score was never mentioned once. But that's neither here nor there. That'll be for our next hour, next time I'm in Dallas. But understanding my family's
I have a lot
history.
to say to that, but go ahead.
Understanding my family's history, understanding that nobody in my family lived here before 1890. Came from Ireland, a place that's colonized, right? Understanding what Oliver Cromwell did to the Irish, sending them to Oliver Cromwell took over Ireland, took all the Irish that were fighting age men, sent them down to their Caribbean colonies, Jamaica specifically, and they burnt up in the sun. So then they forced breeding with the native population. That's where you get the light-skinned Jamaican with the blue eyes and all the Irish last names. And honestly, it's where you get Jamaican patois, right? So understanding all of that, understanding that there was a political party in America called the Know-Nothings that were there to get rid of Catholics, but Irish specifically. Send the Irish back home. Understanding the Irish that came over off the boats were immediately signed up in the Union Army to go fight the South.
Right.
If they wanted their citizenship. More Irish came off the boats and fought to end slavery than actually ever owned slaves themselves. So getting lumped in with the quote-unquote white thing to me was pretty ridiculous when I was like, it's Britain that ate the food. Why am I paying the bill? You're mad at the British. You're not mad at the whites. You're mad at the Brits and probably some Jews, right?
Well, what the Ta-Nehisi Coates crowd would argue was that, well, you know, you may have came over here with your own distinct culture and your own distinct kind of ethos. However, when you saw how the American white man was treating the Negro, you assimilated with the American white man and maybe even tag teamed and joined him in discriminating against the Negro. And so you share in the blame. That's what that crowd would argue.
And there's probably an argument to be made there. But even when they talk about representation in America and stuff like that, again, we look at America has had 8 years of a black president. We haven't had an Italian president. We haven't had a Jewish
You think
president.
we had a black president?
At least half. So 4 years.
Huh.
You don't think you don't claim Barack Obama's black? Then you got to at least take Bill Clinton. I mean,
no, I mean I don't. Well, yes, black. He is half black. There's a lot of people that believe that he's half African. He's not. His dad was a
So Toro, you talking about?
No, that's not his real dad. His real dad is named Frank Fanon or something like that. He was a black Marxist who moved to Hawaii. But the if you look at pictures of Frank Fanon, I don't have my phone. I think
Frank Fanon.
I think that's the name. I'm not entirely sure, but his first name is Frank. I can verify that. But if you look at pictures of him, and I'll send you a text of this later, but if you look at pictures of him and Barack Obama right next to each other, it's like a spitting image. And in fact, Barack Obama write about him in his book, Dreams of My Father. And he was the guy who, after having issues at home, because he lived with his grandparents in Hawaii for a little while, he would go to Frank's house and enjoy a shot of whiskey and just kind of chop it up with him.
Is that right?
So, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. But to take it back to what we were talking about earlier, like the question that you asked me, again, if you look at the way that blacks and whites were trending, they were around about the same. And yes, you had friction, but people don't understand that friction was off the back of a civil war, where you had the death of brothers and fathers.
Oh, for sure.
Sons.
Yeah.
And it was it was a very bloody war. It was an extremely bloody war. And not only did you have a war, in the aftermath of the war, you had what was called Reconstruction. Now, a lot of black folks ignorantly believe that Reconstruction was this great thing. Well,
Is
no,
that right?
it wasn't.
They
It
should
wasn't
have
a great
kept.
thing.
They should have kept Lincoln alive. It would have been way better than for the South than Grant was.
I disagree with that, but I'm not a huge fan of Lincoln, and we can probably get to that on a later podcast. But the thing is, when you look at Reconstruction,
Suspended for people that before you jump down his throat. There's an argument to be made about Abraham Lincoln being the most tyrannical of all American presidents. And again, you're going after people's ethos. They've been taught their whole life. They get rid of the mythology. This guy fought vampires. How dare you? But he did suspend habeas corpus.
Yeah.
He jailed opposition journalists.
Mhm.
There's some things. He was a wartime president and kept the Union together and all these other things.
He wasn't a wartime president when he was elected.
No, he wasn't. And I would say he was set up for failure by James Buchanan. It was horrible.
Fair.
But if the South had known that they wouldn't be allowed to leave the Union, they would have never, ever ratified the Constitution.
There's a lot of theories out there that it was a bait and switch.
Of course it was.
And this is why Patrick Henry didn't even show up to the convention, because he knew what was going on. Like, he knew what would eventually happen, and just like clockwork, it happened.
Oh.
But so after the war was ended, you had Reconstruction, and this was basically carpetbaggers coming down from the north, trying to impose their will on the South,
seizing the cheap property.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so
to the victor goes the spoils,
and they would play the Negro against the white man. This was huge.
Is that right?
It's part of their propaganda campaign. And so you had, naturally, whenever you have this kind of psyop, you then have this kind of, you have people who get emotionally invested in the psyop. They think it's real, and then they start to.
Oh wow! Wow! I mean, just imagine that. Imagine that in today's terms, where you come down, and you're stealing. This widow, whose father and husband just died in the war.
Yeah.
And a northern bank is coming to seize the property.
Yeah.
And she's like, "This is crazy. How are you doing this? We're supposed to be on the same team. We're supposed to be Americans." And then the bank goes, "Oh well, we had to free the black guys." and that's so now who's the real bad guy here? And that makes a ton of sense.
Right.
There's your scapegoat.
Yeah.
There's your divide and conquer.
Right.
Oh wow.
And then when you look at like my family, for example, on my paternal side, my Arkansas family, we still have I think 80 acres of land left over that we acquired from this time, from the end of slavery. And it wasn't acquired by way of Reconstructionism. It was acquired out of a mutual agreement between slave master and slave master and slave.
Is that right?
That had nothing to do with the government. And so, and this kind of thing would happen often. Like when people talk about reparations today, they don't understand that there were payouts, voluntary payouts that slave owners were giving to their slaves as they departed once slavery had officially ended. And not only that, there were a lot of slaves who didn't even want to leave the plantation because it wasn't that they were afraid of the big bad world. It's that we have a way of living here. Like, it's not like, why change it kind of thing. And of course, you know, there's people today, modern Black activists, who would say that, oh, that's because they were docile. These are people who are ignorant and who don't know what they're talking about. Of course, you can look back in the modern age and say, oh, they were docile. You don't know anything about these people. But my thing is like, am I advocating for slavery? No, I'm not. I'm simply recognizing the fact that we were moving away from an old way of doing things, an old economy, and moving into a new order, a new way of doing things, a new kind of economy, new kind of commerce.
Just you want the whole story told.
I want the whole story told.
Tell the whole story.
Right.
And I couldn't agree with you more. And that's where you talk about the reparations idea, and it's like, all right, well, where does it stop? I mean, do we even acknowledge that Tipu Tip existed?
Right.
Do we know who what was it? Mensa Musa?
Mm-hmm.
What was it? You know, I believe he either him or Tipu Tip, they believe, might have been the richest person to ever live.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Black African who was selling Africans.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He was richer than Bill Gates,
Mm-hmm.
By comparative. Right. So, and again, the entire I live by. You talk about ethos. I live by a very simple rule: if the truth kills it, it deserves to die.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
Like Pam Bondi, she should be gone. Day one was a long time ago,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't have the Epstein list. I don't give it whatever you want to say about extenuating circumstances, this and victims that. You said day one, and that was 200 days ago.
Yeah.
You got to go.
Yeah.
If the truth kills it, it deserves to die.
Right.
And when it comes to something as heated as, you know, being the descendant of an enslaved people, now especially as it's been taught for the last 20 years in America, where there are literal angels and demons.
Right.
You are part of the oppressed class, and that you are either oppressor or you are oppressed. You are either good or you are bad. The false binary that Marxism uses to infiltrate and, you know, undercut society. It creates an environment for revolution.
Political fodder.
Yeah,
it's political fodder, and that's kind of the point that I was making, is that, you know, you saw them trending in the same upward trajectory, and then in 1920 you had the second.
Why 1920 specifically?
Well, this was the second Congress of the Communist International in Moscow, where you had a white journalist named John Reed, who was a delegate to the convention, and when he was asked to speak to the convention, he said that the American Negro is a spearhead to the bringing of Marxism and communism to the United States,
because there's no aristocracy.
Right. And so he said
Europe,
that,
it was a class battle because it was where you were born. That's the caste.
Right.
In America, we didn't have that.
Yeah.
So
And
we had to create that.
We have a lot to work with. These people were just recently freed from slavery, and, you know, less than 100 years ago. There is Jim Crow laws that exist, and
segregation.
And segregation, like, I mean, even that, like, and this is just finish my point earlier before I make this next point. When it comes to separation, it was a necessary thing for a limited time, for a temporary time. And you can look back at Booker T. Washington's speech in Atlanta. It was the Atlanta Exposition. And he basically spoke of the necessity for Negroes to kind of come together, cast down your bucket where you are, invest in themselves by way of education, by way of the trades, by way of just family formation, so on and so forth, and really kind of hone their craft. And it's necessary for white folks to do the same as well. And then after a time when the tensions from the Civil War begin to dissipate, when the tensions that are brought about by whatever means begin to dissipate, we will learn to come back together by way of the marketplace, by way of the churches, and so on and so forth. And we can be as individual as the fingers, but as strong as the hand. And this was the speech that he gave. to a overcrowded audience of both blacks and whites in Atlanta, Georgia. W.E.B. Du Bois basically lambasted the speech as the Atlanta Compromise. Oh, he's trying to compromise with white slavers, and of course the black intellectual community completely just dismissed Booker T. Washington. But for the people who were actually using their hands to toil the fields, they understood the wisdom in what he was saying. It was for a time, and not only was it a speech that he gave in Atlanta, it was something that actually had a real world impact, because you began to see the falling away of Jim Crow laws at the private level. At the end of when I say private, I mean businesses that had implemented separation policies within their workplaces. You began to see those begin to dissipate. You saw these Jim Crow laws being repealed at the local level, and in some cases at the state level, depending on which state we're talking about. This continued to happen well up until 1954, before the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So what Booker T. Washington was advocating for was actually working this kind of incremental dissipation of the friction that existed as a result of the aftermath of the Civil War. Now,
organic integration as opposed to forced integration.
Exactly. And so in 1920, what John Reed told the Communist Comintern is that the Negro in the South is not politically conscious. They are still, because mind you, Booker T. Washington died in 1915, so this would have been 5 years later. He said these Negroes in the South are still talking about Booker T. Washington, and they're still implementing his program. Now, this is unfortunate for the communists, because they don't want the blacks in the South to make their own way by capitalistic means. They don't want Joe, the shoe store owner, to make a means for himself and his family by selling shoes at the shoe store, to the miner who will then buy those shoes and go mine do his mining, and this have this kind of cyclical kind of marketplace. They don't want that, because to the extent that you have that, you don't have any use for a communist or the NAACP for that matter. And so he said we need to raise the consciousness of the American Negro, and if we do that, we'll have a foothold into the United States. And so Vladimir Lenin greenlit the strategy of raising the political conscience of the Negro by any means necessary. And so over the course of the 1920s, you see the springing up of race riots happening seemingly out of nowhere. Rosewood happened in the 1920s. Black Wall Street happened in the 1920s. All of these race riots that were happening in Harlem, North Carolina, all over the place happened out of nowhere. And so I took it upon myself to research what was the powder keg that set these things off. Well, let's take Tulsa and I'm going to just cover this very briefly. So if you look at Tulsa, that's the biggest one that people harken back to and say, like, this is why capitalism doesn't work for black folks. This is why.
I'm listening to you. I just got to text Brady.
No, you're good. And I'll make this quick.
Yeah, you're good.
But there's people who today say black people can't get ahead in America because capitalism doesn't work for them. Just look at Black Wall Street. Anytime we try to build something, here along comes racist white people to burn it down. And they believe that the reason why whites burned down Black Wall Street was because whites were jealous of all of the prosperity that blacks were yielding there in the early 1920s. Well, the reality of it is there was an incident on an elevator with this guy, Dick Rowland, and a young white lady. And he was arrested, awaiting trial. And the sheriff wanted to protect him because he knew that there was a lot of fishy stuff going on. And there was a article that was published by the Tulsa Tribune. The editor of that of the Tulsa Tribune was a white journalist by the name of Richard Lloyd Jones. Well, Richard Lloyd Jones was a fellow traveler. He was a self-admitted or self-described, I should say, progressive. And he himself,
just like Upton Sinclair,
right.
Which oddly enough, this is all war propaganda.
Yeah.
This is a social strife, a war that they're trying to put together.
So he wrote this article titled "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl on Elevator." This was an article written by a so-called progressive, someone who's supposed to be for civil rights and human rights, writes an article nab Negro for attacking girl on elevator. And the purpose of that article was meant to rile up this kind of friction between people who were before then getting along quite fine.
Yeah,
And
you can't Trojan horse extremist ideology inside of black pain without the body.
Right. Well, that's true. That's true. And so there was another journalist. He wrote I forget who he wrote for, but he was a member of the NAACP. He was a black guy named AJ Smitherman. And so he attempted to rile up the blacks in Tulsa. And sure enough, both of those things worked. So the black showed up to the jailhouse. The white showed up to the jailhouse. There was a shot that rang out. Nobody knows who shot the first shot.
Pallets of bricks there.
And sure enough, it went haywire. It was a huge brawl. By the first account, it was a handful of whites and I think maybe double the number of blacks who died. I think it was like 6 whites and 12 blacks who were died. And then, of course, as the years go on, the numbers keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, the whites get lower and the blacks get bigger.
It'll be 6 million.
Exactly. Yeah, well, let's not go there. But so this thing happens, and less than 3 years later, the entirety of Black Wall Street's built back completely. And there's video footage of this because there was a Negro pastor named Solomon Sir Jones. He was an amateur videographer. He built his own camera. He would go around the country shooting videos, and he even got some videos from parts of Oklahoma where my mom's side of the family is from. But in any event, he would have these kind of boards. These I forget what they're called, and I should know this as a filmmaker. But he would have these boards that have the text of what it is you're about to see before he shows you the footage. And if you look at the dates, Tulsa, Greenwood District, 1923, 1924, 1925, you see black people
You're talking about title cards?
Yeah, title cards. There
Yeah.
you go. Why did I not know that? But anyway, so he's shooting footage 1922, 3, 4, 5 of these events going on in the Greenwood District, the same district that we were told, which is the Black Wall Street district, that was just burned down completely. It never saw the light of day again. Again, footage of 4th of July parades, black people marching down the street, dressed to the nines, American flags, banners. You see cafes, literally cafes where black men are in there just eating cake and just yucking it up. You see another footage of behind a restaurant, blacks who are unloading a truck that's bringing stock, just life as usual. And then too, you see white people kind of sprinkled in here and there, so visiting these cafes, visiting these places. And I also found it to be true that whenever they were building back Black Wall Street, white people helped build back Black Wall Street. So why are we not learning about these components of it? Well, the reason why, again, and I'll be remiss if I don't emphasize this as I close this out, is the reason why the communists had a vested interest in the 1920s to spring race riots is because what Booker T. Washington predicted was coming to fruition. And as Manning Johnson said, the communists wanted blacks to unite not with the white, like ordinary white people, but with the white communists. That's what they wanted. And so to the extent that blacks were beginning to make their own way, the so-called capitalistic way, here along came the communists to try to clandestinely spring up these riots, burn down the business, because that's key. You have to burn down the business. Yep. Your riot's not successful if the black business isn't burned down. Because if Joe doesn't have a shoe store to go to tomorrow, yeah, he's going to run into the arms of the NAACP.
And it's very interesting.
Or the Communist Party.
It's very interesting, even in the 2020 riots. If you burn down a government building, that's the no-no. But if you burn down the black business owner, if you burn down the building of that poor guy that was the firefighter in Minnesota who saved up 20 years to buy his sports bar and lost it. And then the crazy lady outside was like, I don't care, these people have insurance. And it's like, imagine me coming up to you, punching you in the face, breaking your orbital bone, and being like, I don't care, you got health insurance.
Yeah, you got health insurance.
It's not, so, and we do have to wrap up here, man. I'm enjoying this conversation so much, but very, very quick. What do you think is next? Where do you think we go from here as a people and as a country?
I think I mentioned it earlier. As far as just again, we're now moving into an advanced stage of the technocracy, where everything is being digitized, where you now have artificial intelligence, robotics, things of this nature. Again, I predict that in the next 5 years, which seems a little aggressive, but I predict that you'll see a huge shift in the way people make a living. And as a result of this, you will see a kind of grievance that sweeps society. And then you'll see it crying out um, for a special kind of government that will then restructure society in order to accommodate this kind of changing dynamic. I see that happening.
The de-evolution into a pure nanny state.
There you go. And so, and this has been like, we've been on the track, maybe not the artificial intelligence
Done
thing.
that before. It was called feudalism.
There you go. But you've seen this kind of trend into the direction that we're heading, that I would date back to the turn of the 20th century, with the springing up of all these social justice movements. And so what I try to do with my films and with the material that I'm now writing and things that I'm working on is to educate people as it pertains to history, to show them how we as a people have fallen for demagoguery before, and how the threat to fall for it again is ever before us. And so my encouragement is always just, to be the man that God has ordained you to be. He's given all of us limbs. He's given all of us a mind to think, and the ability to do. And we constantly retreat and punt that responsibility off to big government, off to someone else, instead of taking that responsibility on ourselves. We don't have to be inextricably intertwined with the system. We can detach from it. We can plant gardens. We can do all. And I know that sounds very like kumbaya, and that's not the place that I'm coming from. But we have to resolve to be as independent as we possibly can, and to link up with like-minded people.
Clean your own yard before you worry about your neighbors.
Right, and not run to the same government that's created that problem to come up with a solution to the problem.
Absolutely. Chad Orenthal Jackson? Is it Orenthal? What do we got?
No, I'm not OJ. It's what's my middle? O'Neill.
Chad O. Jackson. Can't thank you enough for coming. Where can people find you?
You can find me at Chad O. Jackson on YouTube, X, and IG.
I love your work, man, and I hope you come back on next time I'm in Dallas. Yeah. We have so much more we have to cover. This flew by. Chad Jackson. Guys, if you like this episode, go to tellerx.com. Use code SNT for 20% off of all of your health needs. That's Ozempic. That's something for your acne. That's something, Ozempic makes you smaller. The Viagra makes you bigger. All there. tellerx.com. Use code SNT for 20% off. Check me out. I'll be on the road the whole rest of the month. I got shows with Dave Landau, Brian Callen, and headlining myself all over Texas, Florida, Tennessee, and now we've just added Albuquerque, New Mexico, and New Jersey and New York. So check it out at Gerard vs. Evil. Chad O. Jackson, thank you so much for coming. We'll see you guys next time.